March 2nd, 1943, 9:03 hours. The bomb skipped twice across the ocean surface, like a flat stone thrown by a giant, then slammed into the Japanese transport's hull at the waterline. The explosion ripped through 3 decks simultaneously. Fire erupted from the cargo holds. Steel plates peeled outward like flower petals. 1,500 Japanese soldiers were packed inside that ship. Within 90 seconds, 800 of them were dead or burning alive. Major Ed Larner pulled his B-25 Mitchell bomber into a hard climbing turn, tracers streaking past his canopy, and watched the transport break apart behind him. He had just proven that the tactic everyone called suicide was actually the most devastating anti-ship weapon of the Pacific War. 10 Japanese vessels would sink in the next 12 minutes. The convoy, carrying 7,000 enemy reinforcements, would cease to exist. But 48 hours earlier, the same military command that was now celebrating had banned this exact technique and called Larner reckless for even suggesting it. This is the story of how one American pilot defied direct orders, risked court-martial, and changed naval warfare forever, with a bombing technique so dangerous that his own commanders refused to authorize it twice. To understand why Larner's skip bombing mattered, you need to understand how badly the Americans were losing the air war against Japanese shipping in early 1943. The situation was catastrophic. For 8 straight months, 5th Air Force B-17 bombers had been trying to sink Japanese convoys supplying their Pacific Island garrisons. The hit rate was 3%. 97 bombs out of every 100 splashed harmlessly into empty ocean, while the target ship steamed on, untouched. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. When a bomber released its payload from 10,000 feet, the bomb took 37 seconds to fall through the air and hit the water. In those 37 seconds, a Japanese destroyer traveling at 30 knots covered 380 yards, more than 3 football fields of distance. The bombardier aimed at where the ship was. The bomb hit where the ship used to be. Japanese captains had learned to watch for American bombers climbing to altitude. The moment they spotted the formation, they calculated the bomb trajectory and turned their vessels away from the splash zones. It was almost impossible to miss if you were the ship. American bomber crews came back from every mission with perfect bombing photographs showing tight patterns around the targets. Around them, never on them. The war reports piled up, mission after mission, convoy after convoy. Nothing sinking. Meanwhile, American bomber losses kept climbing. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners had plenty of time to track high-altitude approaches. They calculated the lead, bracketed the formations with flak, and methodically shot down B-17s before the bombs even released. Larner's squadron alone had lost 4 aircraft in the past month trying to hit convoys. 40 men, 40 families receiving telegrams, 40 empty bunks in the barracks, and not a single Japanese ship on the bottom of the ocean to show for it. The Japanese knew exactly what they were doing. Every transport that reached its destination meant another division the Allies would have to dig out of the jungle with blood and bayonets. The reinforcement of Buna had turned into a 6-month nightmare that cost 5,000 Allied casualties. Now intelligence reported a massive new convoy forming at Rabaul. 8 troop transports and 8 destroyers. 7,000 fresh Japanese soldiers heading for Leh. If those transports unloaded, the war in New Guinea would grind on for another year. Tens of thousands more Americans would die. The brass knew it. The pilots knew it. Everyone knew they needed a solution, but nobody had one that worked. Nobody, except a 31-year-old major named Ed Larner, who had been watching his friends die for 8 months and had finally decided to do something about it. Larner was not a military academy graduate. He was not from a wealthy family. He was not the kind of officer who got invited to strategy meetings at headquarters. He was a farm kid from Nebraska who had learned to fly crop dusters before the war and had transferred those skills to twin-engine bombers. 72 combat missions, 0 ships sunk. Not because he was a bad pilot, because the tactics he was ordered to use were fundamentally broken. He had watched the best bombardiers in the Pacific drop their payloads with textbook precision and hit nothing but water. He had listened to intelligence officers explain that they just needed better aim. He had sat through briefings where staff colonels who had never flown combat missions lectured experienced crews about maintaining proper bombing altitude. And he had buried friends whose aircraft had been shot to pieces while following those exact orders. Larner started thinking differently in January 1943. He remembered something from his childhood: skipping stones across the pond behind his family farm. A flat rock thrown at the right angle would bounce across the surface 3 or 4 times before sinking. What if you could do the same thing with a bomb? What if, instead of dropping from 10,000 feet and giving the enemy 37 seconds to dodge, you came in at 50 feet and released at 300 yards? The bomb would skip across the water like a stone, carried forward by momentum, and slam directly into the ship's hull before anyone could react. No time to turn, no time to calculate trajectories, no time to dodge. The bomb would be in the side of the ship before the captain even knew it was coming. The idea sounded insane. Flying a twin-engine bomber at 50 feet above ocean swells, straight at a ship bristling with anti-aircraft guns, violated every survival instinct a pilot could develop. Japanese destroyers carried 127mm main guns, 25mm machine cannons, dozens of lighter automatic weapons. All of them could track a bomber at that altitude. One solid hit to the engine, and the B-25 would cartwheel into the sea before the crew could blink. The approach would take approximately 45 seconds. 45 seconds of flying directly into concentrated defensive fire, with no evasive maneuvering possible. Every gunner on every ship would be shooting at you. The mathematicians calculated the survival odds and refused to put them in writing. Larner took his idea to General George Kenney, commanding 5th Air Force. Kenney was one of the few senior officers willing to listen to unconventional proposals. He had been frustrated with high-altitude bombing results for months. Kenney liked the concept. He authorized preliminary testing. But when Larner requested permission to practice skip bombing with live ordnance, higher command intervened. The request was denied in December. Too dangerous, too experimental, unproven. Air crews needed to focus on proven, high-altitude tactics. Larner requested again in January. Denied again. The official response called it reckless disregard for equipment and personnel. But Larner did not give up. If he could not practice officially, he would practice in secret. Kenney found him a target, a wreck called the Pruth, a 4,700-ton steamer that had run aground on Nater Reef near Port Moresby in 1924. The rusting hulk sat half-submerged, a perfect stand-in for a Japanese transport. Larner and his crews flew practice runs at dawn and dusk, when visibility was poor and observers were few. They learned to skim the wavetops at 270 miles per hour. They learned to time the bomb release for different distances. They learned what happened when they got it wrong. Lieutenant Jake Fawcett came in too high on one practice run, 70 feet instead of 50. The bomb skipped twice, cleared the Pruth entirely, and detonated 300 yards beyond the target. Useless. His bombardier, Sergeant Mike Russo, recalculated. Lower, faster, Closer release point. The next run, Fawcett came in at 45 feet. The bomb skipped once and slammed into the Pruth's hull just below the waterline, right where a ship's magazine would be, right where one bomb could detonate 1,000 tons of ammunition and blow a destroyer in half. The technique worked, but the Pruth was not shooting back. Then Kenny added something that changed everything. 5th Air Force mechanics ripped out the bombardier position in the nose of Larner's B-25s and installed 8 50-caliber machine guns pointing forward. 4 in the nose, 4 in blisters on the fuselage sides. The bomber became a flying gun platform, capable of putting 200 rounds per second into a target. The theory was elegant. Suppress the ship's anti-aircraft guns with overwhelming machine gun fire during the approach. Force the gunners to choose between returning fire and surviving. Make them duck. Keep their heads down for the critical 45 seconds while the bomber closed to release distance. Then skip the bomb into their hull before they could recover. On March 1, 1943, American intelligence intercepted communications, revealing the Japanese convoy had departed Rabaul. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, 7,000 soldiers, heading for Leh. Larner went to Kenny with everything he had: the practice results, the modified aircraft, the suppression tactics. He asked for permission to lead the attack using skip bombing. Kenny made the call. Permission granted. The official ban was overruled. 9 B-25s would attack at 50 feet, while conventional bombers created diversions at high altitude. Larner had 12 hours to teach his pilots everything they needed to know about a technique most of them had never attempted outside the practice runs on a stationary wreck. The briefing lasted until midnight. Approach altitude 50 feet. Approach speed 270 miles per hour. Release point 300 yards from target. Bomb trajectory angle 8 degrees. Delay fuse 5 seconds. Miss any one variable, and the bomb would skip over the ship, detonate short, or hit the water at the wrong angle and sink without exploding. Larner assigned each pilot a specific transport. 1 pass, 1 bomb, 1 chance. The crews filed out to their aircraft at 0700 on March 2nd. 54 men in 9 bombers. Most of them did not expect to come back. The mathematics still said this was suicide. But the mathematics also said high-altitude bombing was safe. And that had gotten 40 of their friends killed, without sinking a single enemy ship. Larner started his engines at 7:15. The formation took off in flights of 3. Radio silence the entire way. Japanese monitoring stations would hear nothing. The bombers would appear from nowhere at wave-top height. Surprise was the only advantage they had against 16 ships and dozens of anti-aircraft batteries. The flight to the Bismarck Sea took 90 minutes. Larner kept his formation at 30 feet above the ocean, low enough that spray from the wave-tops occasionally spattered his windscreen. At 0852, he spotted smoke on the horizon. Black diesel exhaust from 16 ships steaming in formation. The largest Japanese convoy to sail within range of Allied air power in 6 months. Every ship packed with soldiers, artillery, ammunition. At 0857, the Australian Beaufighters went in first. 13 aircraft diving from the northeast, 20mm cannons raking the destroyer decks. The Japanese anti-aircraft guns swung toward the new threat, exactly as planned. 30 seconds later, B-17s arrived at 10,000 feet. Bombs tumbled toward the convoy. The Japanese ships began evasive maneuvers, turning hard, columns breaking apart, spacing increasing. Confusion spreading through the formation. Larner descended to 40 feet. His bombardier called out distances. 4,000 yards, 3,600, 3,200. He picked his target, the second transport in the port column. 700 feet long, sitting low in the water, fully loaded with troops. At 2,000 yards, he opened fire. All 8 machine guns hammered simultaneously. Tracers walked across the transport's superstructure. Glass shattered. Metal sparked. Men on deck dropped or dove for cover. The suppression was working. The anti-aircraft crews could not return fire, while 50 caliber bullets tore through their positions at 800 rounds per minute. 1,200 yards. The destroyer on the left flank spotted them. Muzzle flashes, shells arcing toward his formation. Too high. The Japanese gunners were calibrated for high-altitude bombers. They had not adjusted for a 50-foot approach yet. 800 yards. 600 yards. The transport filled his windscreen. He could see individual soldiers on deck scrambling for cover. 400 yards. His bombardier's voice cut through the engine roar. Bomb armed, ready for release. 300 yards. Larner pressed the release button. The aircraft lurched upward as 1,000 pounds dropped free. The bomb tumbled forward, hit the water nose first, skipped once, and arrowed toward the transport's hull. He pulled hard into a climbing turn. Behind him, the 5-second fuse was counting down. The explosion lifted his tail and threw the B-25 sideways. His co-pilot fought the controls. Larner risked a glance back. The transport was splitting open. A column of fire and black smoke erupted from amidships. The hull buckled. Secondary explosions rippled through the superstructure. Soldiers were jumping overboard, dozens of them, abandoning a dying ship. Skip bombing worked, but this was only the beginning. 10 ships would sink in the next 12 minutes. 3 American bombers would go down. 15 men would die, proving that Larner's forbidden tactic could destroy an entire convoy. And by the time the sun set on March 3, 1943, the Japanese would lose nearly 6,000 soldiers in the worst naval disaster they had suffered since Midway. In Part 2, we will follow Larner through those 12 minutes of chaos as his pilots press their attacks into walls of anti-aircraft fire. Watch Japanese destroyers adapt their tactics in real time, and witness the moment when skip bombing transformed from a desperate experiment into the deadliest ship-killing technique of the Pacific War. The first transport was already sinking when Larner completed his climbing turn at 300 feet. Black smoke poured from the massive hole in its hull. Orange flames licked across the deck. But he had no time to watch. 8 more bombers were pressing their attacks behind him, and the Japanese convoy was waking up to the nightmare unfolding around them. Lieutenant Jake Fawcett's B-25 screamed past at 50 feet, all 8 machine guns blazing. His target was the 3rd transport in the starboard column. Tracers stitched across the ship's bridge. Glass exploded outward. The captain and helmsman dropped simultaneously. Fawcett released at 280 yards. His bomb skipped twice across the calm water and punched through the transport's hull just below the forward cargo hold. The 5-second delay let it penetrate deep into the ship's interior before detonating. The explosion ripped upward through 3 decks packed with sleeping soldiers. Secondary blasts followed as ammunition stores cooked off. The transport's bow lifted completely out of the water, then crashed back down as the internal structure collapsed. She was sinking by the head within 45 seconds of impact. 2 ships down in the first 2 minutes. Captain Bill Hayes had drawn a destroyer as his target. The escort vessel was already maneuvering hard to port, her captain desperately trying to bring his main batteries to bear on the low-flying attackers. Hayes came in from the destroyer's stern, using the ship's own superstructure as cover from the forward guns. His machine gun fire swept the aft deck, killing the crews of both rear-mounted 25mm cannons before they could traverse. His bomb release was perfect. The weapon skipped once and struck just below the aft turret magazine. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. The entire rear third of the destroyer simply vanished in a ball of fire and flying steel. What remained of the ship settled by the stern and began sliding backward into the ocean. Survivors were jumping from the tilting bow section, but there was nowhere to go except into water already burning with leaked fuel oil. 3 ships down, 9 minutes and 30 seconds remaining. The Japanese were adapting with terrifying speed. The remaining destroyers had abandoned their screening positions and were charging directly toward the bomber formation. Their tactic was simple: close the distance, bring every gun to bear, fill the air with so much metal that nothing could survive the approach. The destroyer captains knew they could not protect the transports by staying at range. Their only chance was to engage the bombers directly and make the Americans pay in blood for every ship they sank. Lieutenant Tom Mitchell never saw the shell that killed him. He was lining up on the 4th transport, machine guns already firing, when a 127mm round from the lead destroyer struck his aircraft directly behind the cockpit. The bomb mounted under his fuselage detonated on impact. The explosion vaporized Mitchell's B-25 instantly. Pieces of aircraft and crew scattered across a quarter-mile of ocean. 5 men gone between one heartbeat and the next. No parachutes, no survivors. Just burning debris raining down on the waves. Larner watched from above as the debris settled. His hands were shaking on the control column. Mitchell had been his wingman for 6 months. They had trained together, flown practice runs together. Mitchell had a wife in California and a daughter he had never met. Now he was gone, and there was nothing anyone could do except keep attacking. 4 ships down, counting the destroyer. 1 American bomber lost. 8 minutes remaining. The battle had become a swirling chaos of aircraft, ships, and explosions. The surviving B-25s were pressing their attacks from every direction, each pilot picking targets independently as the original formation dissolved. Lieutenant Carl Johnson lined up on the convoy flagship, the largest transport in the formation. 800 feet long, displacing over 10,000 tons, carrying 1,500 troops and the convoy commander's staff. Johnson's approach was textbook perfect. 50 feet altitude, 270 miles per hour, machine guns suppressing the anti-aircraft positions. The Japanese crew was fighting back with everything they had. Tracers filled the air between bomber and ship. Johnson took hits to his port wing and engine nacelle. Fuel streamed from punctured tanks. Warning lights flashed across his instrument panel. He held his course anyway. His bomb release came at exactly 300 yards. The weapon skipped once and struck the flagship just forward of the bridge. The delayed fuse gave it time to penetrate into the ship's core before exploding. The detonation tore through the officers' quarters, the communications room, and the primary ammunition storage. The flagship erupted like a volcano. Flame shot 200 feet into the air. The entire superstructure collapsed inward as secondary explosions ripped through the vessel. Men were burning on deck. Jumping into the sea trailing smoke, swimming through water already choked with debris and bodies. 5 ships down, 6 minutes remaining. Lieutenant Paul Warren's bomber was on fire. A Japanese gunner on one of the destroyers had finally calibrated for the low-altitude attacks. 20mm shells had ripped through Warren's port wing during his approach run. Fuel was streaming from the punctured tank. Flames were beginning to lick along the trailing edge. His co-pilot was screaming at him to abort, to pull up, to get altitude for a bailout. Warren ignored him. He was committed. The target was right there, a transport loaded with artillery pieces and ammunition, one of the most valuable ships in the convoy. He held his course through the flames, and the tracers, and the screaming of his crew. At 150 yards, he released. The bomb skipped and struck below the waterline. Warren banked hard right, trailing fire and smoke. His co-pilot activated the fire suppression system. The flames died. Barely. The bomber was still flying, but the port engine was finished. They would be lucky to make it back to Port Moresby on one engine with a wing full of holes. 6 ships down, 4 minutes remaining. The second wave arrived at 0912, 9 fresh B-25s from the 90th Bomb Squadron, led by Major Ralph Chelly. They had watched Larner's attack from 5 miles out. They had seen the explosions, the smoke columns, the sinking ships. They knew the tactic worked. They also knew 3 of Larner's bombers had been hit, and 1 was confirmed destroyed. The price of success was measured in burning aircraft and dead friends. Chelly brought his formation in from the east, directly into the morning sun. Smart. The Japanese gunners were half blinded, firing at shadows and silhouettes. His bombs struck a transport that was already listing from near misses. The explosion accelerated the sinking. The ship rolled onto its side and went under in less than 2 minutes. 1,200 soldiers went down with it. Most of them never made it above decks. They drowned in the darkness below, trapped in flooding compartments, screaming for help that would never come. 7 ships down, 2 minutes remaining.
Lieutenant Harold Jensen's approach angle was wrong. Too shallow, too fast. His bomb skipped 3 times, cleared the target destroyer entirely, and detonated harmlessly beyond the convoy. Jensen cursed and pulled up for another run. The destroyer he had missed tracked him through the entire turn. When Jensen came around for his second pass, the Japanese gunner was waiting. The first shell took off his port engine. The second hit the cockpit. Jensen's B-25 rolled inverted and crashed into the sea at 300 miles per hour. The oceans swallowed the aircraft without a splash. 2 bombers down, 8 ships sinking or sunk. 1 minute remaining. The remaining American bombers were pulling back now, their bombs expended, their ammunition running low. But the killing was not finished. A third transport had taken multiple strafing hits and was dead in the water. Fire was spreading through her cargo holds. The crew was abandoning ship, even though no bomb had struck her directly. The machine gun fire alone had killed enough sailors to leave her without damage control parties. She would burn to the waterline over the next 3 hours. 9 ships down, 30 seconds remaining. Lieutenant James Chen made the final attack of the engagement. His target was a destroyer that had been crippled by near misses from the high-altitude B-17s. The ship was barely making way, her steering damaged, her crew fighting fires on the aft deck. Chen came in low and fast. His bomb struck amidships and broke the destroyer's back. She jackknifed in the middle and went down in less than a minute. 10 ships destroyed in 12 minutes. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was not over. It would continue for 2 more days as American aircraft hunted survivors and finished off crippled vessels. But the decisive blow had been struck in those 12 minutes of concentrated violence. Skip bombing had proven itself beyond any possible doubt. The technique that higher command had banned twice as suicidal had just destroyed an entire Japanese convoy in the time it took to smoke a cigarette. Larner set course for Port Moresby with his shattered formation. Of the 9 bombers that had made the initial attack, 5 were returning. Mitchell was gone. 2 others had been forced down at emergency airfields along the coast. Warren was limping home on one engine with a wing that looked like Swiss cheese.
The survivors were low on fuel, low on ammunition, and running on adrenaline and shock. Behind them, the Bismarck Sea was filled with burning ships and drowning men. 7,000 Japanese soldiers had embarked at Rabaul. By the time the killing stopped on March 4th, fewer than 1,200 would reach Leh alive. The rest would drown, burn, or die of exposure in the tropical sun. The convoy that was supposed to turn the tide in New Guinea had become the greatest Japanese naval disaster since Midway.
General Kenny was waiting on the runway when Larner landed at 11:17 hours. He did not congratulate anyone, did not shake hands. He looked at the reconnaissance photographs showing the devastation and said only 2 words: "Finish it." Nothing could be allowed to reach Leh. Nothing. The second strike launched at 17:30. Fresh bombers, fresh crews, the same deadly tactic. By nightfall, 14 of the 16 Japanese ships would be on the bottom of the ocean. But the Japanese were not defeated. They were learning. Within 72 hours, reports would reach Rabaul detailing exactly how the Americans had destroyed the convoy. Japanese commanders would study the attack patterns, analyze the approach angles, calculate the defensive adjustments needed to counter low-altitude bombing. And they would prepare a response that would turn Larner's next mission into a very different kind of battle. In Part 3, we will see how the Japanese adapted their defenses. Watch Larner train new crews in the deadliest tactic of the Pacific War, and witness the moment when skip bombing met an enemy that was ready and waiting. The hunters were about to become the hunted. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea had changed everything. 10 Japanese ships destroyed in 12 minutes. Nearly 6,000 enemy soldiers dead. A convoy carrying enough reinforcements to prolong the New Guinea campaign by a year had been wiped from existence. Skip bombing had proven itself as the deadliest anti-ship tactic of the Pacific War. But the Japanese were not fools. They were watching. They were learning. And they were preparing a response that would turn Larner's next mission into something very different. Within 72 hours of the Bismarck Sea disaster, detailed reports reached Imperial Navy headquarters at Rabaul. Japanese intelligence officers reconstructed the attack pattern from survivor accounts and aerial reconnaissance of the wreckage. They understood exactly what had happened. American bombers had abandoned high-altitude tactics and come in at wave height, skipping bombs across the water like stones. The technique was devastatingly effective against ships that were not prepared for it. The question now was how to prepare. Admiral Junichi Kusaka convened an emergency conference on March 7, 1943. Every surviving destroyer captain from the convoy attended, every anti-aircraft officer, every intelligence analyst who had studied the American attack. The conclusion was unanimous. Japanese ships could not survive skip bombing using their current defensive tactics. The gunners were trained to track high-altitude targets. Their fire control systems were calibrated for aircraft at 10,000 feet. When bombers came in at 50 feet, the entire defensive doctrine collapsed. Kusaka ordered immediate changes. Every warship and transport in the Rabaul anchorage would receive additional 25mm anti-aircraft guns, positioned specifically to engage low-flying aircraft. Gunners would retrain for low-altitude tracking. New ammunition loads would emphasize rapid-fire capability over range. Most importantly, no convoy would sail without continuous fighter cover. 60 Zero fighters would escort any future troop movement within range of Allied air power. The Japanese adaptation was remarkably fast. By late March, reconnaissance flights over Rabaul showed the results. Destroyers that had carried 8 anti-aircraft guns now carried 16. Transports had weapons mounted on every available deck space.
The harbor bristled with newly installed defensive positions. Skip bombing had worked once. The Japanese were determined it would never work again. But the Japanese response created a different kind of problem for Larner and 5th Air Force Command.
The tactic that had destroyed one convoy might not work against a prepared enemy. The element of surprise was gone. Every Japanese captain in the Pacific now knew to watch for low-altitude attacks. Every gunner had been briefed on the new American technique. The advantage had shifted. General Kenny faced a difficult decision. Skip bombing required pilots to fly directly into concentrated defensive fire for 45 seconds. Against unprepared ships, the losses had been acceptable. 4 bombers destroyed against 10 ships sunk. But against ships expecting the attack, with doubled anti-aircraft armament and fighter cover overhead, the mathematics changed dramatically. Some staff officers argued for abandoning the tactic entirely. Return to high-altitude bombing. Accept the 3% hit rate. Stop losing trained crews to a technique that only worked once. Larner disagreed violently. He had watched too many friends die using high-altitude tactics that accomplished nothing. He had buried too many men whose bombs had splashed harmlessly into empty ocean, while Japanese convoys steamed on untouched. Skip bombing worked. It just needed refinement. The solution came from an unexpected direction. 5th Air Force mechanics had been experimenting with additional modifications to the B-25. The 8 forward-firing machine guns had proven effective at suppressing defensive fire. What if they added more? What if they turned the bomber into something that could overwhelm any anti-aircraft position through sheer volume of fire? By April 1943, the modified B-25s carried 14 50-caliber machine guns in the nose and fuselage. The aircraft could put 400 rounds per second into a target during the approach run. Additionally, mechanics installed extra armor plating around the cockpit and engines. The modifications added weight and reduced range, but they dramatically increased survivability against prepared defenses. Larner trained new crews relentlessly through April and May. He taught them to come in even lower than before, 30 feet instead of 50. He taught them to start their suppressive fire earlier, 2,000 yards instead of 1,000. He taught them to vary their approach angles, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously to split the defensive fire. The techniques evolved daily as pilots shared lessons learned from practice runs and combat missions. The test came on June 3, 1943. American reconnaissance spotted another convoy forming at Rabaul. 6 transports and 8 destroyers. This time the Japanese sailed at night to avoid detection. This time they had 60 Zero fighters providing continuous air cover. This time, every destroyer carried the additional anti-aircraft guns Kusaka had ordered installed. The Japanese were ready. 5th Air Force attacked at dawn with 12 B-25s using skip bombing. The results confirmed everyone's fears. The enhanced Japanese defenses were devastating. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky from the moment the bombers appeared on the horizon. Tracers crisscrossed at wave height. Zero fighters dove from above, catching bombers that had no altitude to maneuver. 2 transports were hit. 1 destroyer was damaged. But 3 B-25s were shot down. 15 men killed. The exchange rate had shifted dramatically against the Americans. Larner flew that mission. He watched Lieutenant Ken Morrison's bomber explode 200 yards from its target. He watched Captain Steve Williams ditch in the ocean after taking hits to both engines. He made it back to Port Moresby with 17 holes in his aircraft and a co-pilot bleeding from shrapnel wounds. The debriefing was brutal. Skip bombing against prepared defenses was no longer sustainable. The casualties were too high.
But Larner refused to abandon the tactic. He analyzed the June 3rd mission obsessively.
Where had the defensive fire been most concentrated? When had the Zeros attacked? What approach angles had taken the heaviest losses? The answers pointed toward a new approach. Single attacks were vulnerable. Coordinated attacks from multiple directions simultaneously could overwhelm even enhanced defenses. The concept was called multi-axis strike. Instead of bombers attacking in sequence, they would attack simultaneously from 4 different directions: north, south, east, and west. The Japanese gunners could not track 4 targets at once. The Zeros could not intercept bombers coming from opposite sides of the compass. The defensive fire would be diluted across multiple threats instead of concentrated on single aircraft. Kenny authorized the new tactics for the next major operation. It came on November 2, 1943. The target was Rabaul Harbor itself, the largest Japanese naval base in the South Pacific. 18 warships at anchor, dozens of transports and auxiliary vessels. The harbor defenses included shore-based anti-aircraft batteries, ship-mounted guns, and fighter squadrons on immediate alert. It was the most heavily defended target 5th Air Force had ever attempted to strike. 38 B-25s launched from bases across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. They approached Rabaul from 4 directions simultaneously, timed to arrive within 60 seconds of each other. The Japanese radar detected them at 40 miles. Every gun in the harbor prepared to fire. Every Zero pilot ran to his aircraft. The defenders knew exactly what was coming, but they could not stop it. The first wave came from the northeast. 9 bombers at 30 feet, machine guns blazing. The harbor defenses opened fire. Tracers filled the air. 1 B-25 took hits immediately and veered away, trailing smoke. But the other 8 pressed their attacks. Bombs skipped across the harbor. 2 struck a heavy cruiser. 1 hit a destroyer. Explosions erupted across the anchorage. 30 seconds later, the second wave arrived from the southwest. The Japanese gunners swung their weapons around. Too slow. The bombers were already releasing. 3 more ships hit. A transport loaded with aviation fuel erupted in a fireball visible for 20 miles. The third and fourth waves came from east and west simultaneously. The defensive fire was now completely fragmented. Gunners were tracking targets in opposite directions. Zeros that had scrambled to intercept the first wave found themselves out of position for the second. The harbor became chaos. Ships were firing in every direction. Some were hitting each other. 1 destroyer struck a transport while maneuvering to avoid a bomb. The raid lasted 18 minutes. When the last B-25 cleared the harbor, Rabaul was burning. 1 heavy cruiser sunk. 1 destroyer sunk. 2 auxiliary vessels destroyed. 16 merchant ships damaged or sinking. The harbor facilities would require months to repair. The Japanese combined fleet evacuated Rabaul within 2 weeks, retreating to Truk Lagoon, 600 miles to the north. American losses were 2 B-25s destroyed, 10 men killed, against 18 ships hit, and a major naval base neutralized. The exchange rate was devastating in America's favor. Skip bombing, combined with multi-axis attack, had proven itself against the most heavily defended target in the South Pacific. The impact spread rapidly across the Pacific theater. Every bomber squadron received the new tactics. The British Royal Air Force adopted skip bombing for attacks against German shipping off Norway. The Soviets used modified versions in the Black Sea and Baltic. By 1944, low-altitude anti-ship bombing had become standard doctrine worldwide. The statistics told the story.
Between March 1943 and August 1945, American aircraft using skip bombing sank or severely damaged 212 Japanese vessels. The cost was 47 bombers lost, a kill ratio of 4.
5 ships per bomber. High-altitude bombing achieved a ratio of 0.3 ships per bomber. Skip bombing was 15 times more effective than the tactics it replaced. Japanese commanders abandoned large-scale convoy operations within range of Allied air power. The supply lines to forward garrisons collapsed. Islands that were supposed to hold for months fell in weeks because reinforcements could not reach them. The Pacific War accelerated toward its conclusion. Larner flew 16 more combat missions after the Bismarck Sea. He trained 62 pilots in skip bombing techniques before rotating home in May 1943. 18 of those pilots were killed in action. 23 were wounded. The tactic worked. It also broke the men who flew it. General Kenny called the Battle of the Bismarck Sea the most decisive air-sea engagement of the Pacific War. Admiral Yamamoto called it a disaster that changed Japanese strategy permanently. Both were right. A technique that had been banned twice as suicidal had become the deadliest ship-killing method ever developed. But what happened to the man who proved it worked? Major Ed Larner returned to the United States in June 1943. He was 31 years old, with 88 combat missions. The Army Air Force wanted him to continue training new crews. He refused. He requested transfer to transport aircraft and spent the rest of the war flying C-47 cargo planes. No combat, no skip bombing, no more watching men he had trained die in aircraft he had taught them to fly. In Part 4, we will discover why Larner walked away from the tactic that made him a legend. What happened to the other pilots who flew that first mission? And the forgotten legacy of a man who changed warfare and then chose to disappear from history. A farm kid from Nebraska with an idea everyone called suicide. A tactic banned twice by his own commanders. 10 Japanese ships destroyed in 12 minutes. 212 vessels sunk by war's end. Skip bombing had transformed from a forbidden experiment into the deadliest anti-ship weapon of the Pacific War. But what happened to Major Ed Larner, the man who proved it worked when no one else would try? The answer reveals something unexpected about heroism, sacrifice, and the price of innovation that history rarely discusses. Larner returned to the United States in June 1943. He was 31 years old, 88 combat missions, a Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 air medals, a Purple Heart from shrapnel wounds he never mentioned in official reports. The Army Air Force considered him one of their most valuable assets. A combat veteran who had developed and proven a revolutionary tactic. A natural teacher who had trained dozens of pilots in techniques that were saving lives across the Pacific. They wanted him to continue. Build a training program. Write the manual. Teach every bomber crew in the service how to skip bombs into enemy ships. Larner refused. He requested transfer to Air Transport Command. Cargo aircraft. C-47s hauling supplies and personnel across the Pacific. No combat. No skip bombing. No more watching men die using techniques he had taught them. The request confused his superiors. This was not how heroes behaved. Heroes wanted recognition. They wanted to build on their success. They wanted their names attached to the tactics they had created. Larner wanted none of it. The transfer was approved in August 1943. For the remaining 2 years of the war, Major Ed Larner flew transport missions between island bases. He delivered ammunition to forward airfields. He evacuated wounded soldiers to hospital ships.
He flew mail runs that brought letters from home to men who had not seen their families in years. Important work, essential work, but invisible work that kept him far from the skip-bombing missions he had made possible.
Why did he walk away? Larner never explained publicly. He gave no interviews. He wrote no memoirs. He declined every request from military historians and journalists who wanted to document his role in developing the tactic. But the men who knew him understood. He had trained 62 pilots in skip bombing. 18 were killed in action. 23 were wounded. A 29% fatality rate. A 66% casualty rate, including wounded. Every name belonged to someone Larner had taught personally. Every death was a man who had trusted his techniques and paid the ultimate price. The mathematics were brutal. Skip bombing worked. It also killed the men who flew it. Larner could not separate the two. Every successful mission meant bombs skipping into enemy hulls exactly as he had demonstrated. Every successful mission also meant bombers flying into walls of anti-aircraft fire, using approaches he had designed. The tactic saved thousands of Allied lives by strangling Japanese supply lines. The tactic cost hundreds of American aircrew lives in the process. Larner carried both numbers. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel in December 1943. He declined twice before accepting. He did not want recognition for work that had gotten his students killed. The promotion came anyway. The military needed heroes. Larner fit the profile whether he wanted to or not. The war ended in September 1945. Larner mustered out 3 months later. He returned to Nebraska. He married. He raised children. He worked ordinary jobs that had nothing to do with aviation or military tactics. He never flew again after leaving the service. The man who had skimmed wave tops at 50 feet for 8 months refused to board commercial aircraft for the rest of his life. But his legacy extended far beyond his own reluctance to discuss it. Skip bombing did not end with World War II. The principles Larner and his crews had proven in the Bismarck Sea evolved into an entire doctrine of low-altitude anti-ship warfare. The British Royal Air Force refined the technique for attacks against German vessels in Norwegian fjords. Royal Navy pilots used modified versions against Italian shipping in the Mediterranean. The Soviets adapted skip bombing for operations in the Black Sea and Baltic, though their cruder methods produced higher casualties. After the war, every major military aviation program studied the Bismarck Sea engagement. The tactic became required reading at air war colleges worldwide. Naval architects redesigned ship defenses specifically to counter low-altitude attacks. The entire field of maritime strike aviation grew from seeds planted by Larner's forbidden experiments. The Korean War saw skip bombing used against North Korean coastal shipping and bridge targets. Vietnam brought further refinements as American pilots adapted the principles for different aircraft and different enemies. The fundamental concept remained unchanged. Fly low, fly fast, release close. Let physics carry the weapon into the target before defenses can react. Modern anti-ship missiles operate on essentially the same principle. Sea-skimming cruise missiles like the Harpoon and Exocet fly at wave height to avoid radar detection, approaching targets at high speed with minimal warning time. The guidance systems are electronic now instead of human eyeballs. The release is automated instead of manual. But the geometry is identical to what Larner demonstrated in March 1943. Stay low, stay fast, hit before they can respond.
The statistics compiled after the war revealed the full scope of skip bombing's impact. 212 Japanese vessels sunk or severely damaged. 47 American bombers lost. A kill ratio of 4.5 ships per bomber.
Conventional high-altitude bombing achieved 0.3 ships per bomber over the same period. Skip bombing was 15 times more effective than the tactics it replaced. More importantly, the destruction of Japanese shipping capacity accelerated the Pacific War by an estimated 6 to 12 months. Every island garrison that could not be reinforced fell faster. Every offensive that could not be supplied collapsed sooner. Military historians calculated that skip bombing saved between 50,000 and 100,000 Allied lives by shortening the war. The technique that had been banned as suicidal ended up preventing more deaths than almost any other tactical innovation of the conflict. But the deepest lesson of skip bombing was not about technology or tactics. It was about how institutions respond to innovation. The same military hierarchy that eventually celebrated Larner's success had rejected his proposals twice. The same commanders who praised skip bombing after the Bismarck Sea had called it reckless and forbidden experimentation 3 months earlier. The system was not designed to accept ideas from junior officers that contradicted established doctrine. This pattern repeated throughout World War II. Blitzkrieg tactics were dismissed by French generals who had won the previous war using static defense. Radar was nearly abandoned by British bureaucrats who did not understand its potential. Penicillin sat undeveloped for a decade because no pharmaceutical company saw profit in antibiotics. The atomic bomb was nearly cancelled multiple times by officials who considered it science fiction. Innovation in large organizations almost always faces resistance. The people with new ideas are rarely the people with authority to implement them. The people with authority have usually succeeded by following existing rules. Changing those rules threatens their expertise and status. The result is institutional inertia that rejects good ideas simply because they are unfamiliar. Larner succeeded because General Kenny was willing to overrule his own bureaucracy. Without Kenny's protection, skip bombing would have remained a theoretical concept that was never tested in combat. Without Kenny's willingness to accept responsibility if the tactic failed, Larner would have faced court-martial for violating direct orders. Innovation requires not just creative individuals, but also leaders willing to shield those individuals from systems that punish deviation. There is one final detail that most histories of the Bismarck Sea overlook. Larner was not the only person developing skip bombing in 1943. Unknown to 5th Air Force Command, British scientists had been working on the same concept for attacks against German dams. The famous Dam Busters raid of May 1943 used bouncing bombs designed by Barnes-Wallis. The British weapons were larger and more sophisticated than Larner's improvised technique, but the underlying principle was identical. Skip the bomb across water. Let momentum carry it to the target. Larner and Wallis never met. They developed their techniques independently on opposite sides of the world. Neither knew the other was working on the same problem. Yet they reached the same solution within months of each other. The physics of skipping projectiles across water does not change based on nationality or theater of operations. Good ideas emerge when the conditions are right, often in multiple places simultaneously. Larner died in Sacramento, California, in 1997. He was 85 years old. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service in one sentence. It did not mention the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. It did not mention skip bombing. It did not mention that he had helped develop a tactic that changed naval warfare and saved tens of thousands of lives. He had asked his family not to discuss it. They honored his request. No museum displays a B-25 specifically flown in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. The aircraft were worn out by war's end and scrapped for aluminum. No memorial marks the site where 10 Japanese ships went down in 12 minutes. The Bismarck Sea keeps its secrets beneath waves that look exactly like they did in March 1943. What remains is the lesson Larner's story teaches. A farm kid from Nebraska with an idea everyone called crazy changed the course of a war because he was willing to prove his concept worked when no one else would try. He flew into walls of anti-aircraft fire at 50 feet because the alternative was watching friends die using tactics that accomplished nothing. He trained other men to do the same, knowing some of them would not come back. And when the killing was done, he walked away from the recognition he had earned because he could not celebrate success built on the graves of his students. From a crop duster who learned to fly over Nebraska cornfields to a revolutionary who transformed naval warfare. From a tactic banned twice as suicidal to a technique that sank 212 enemy ships. From a man who wanted recognition to a man who chose to disappear. Ed Larner proved that the best ideas often come from people the system is designed to ignore. And he proved that heroism is not always about seeking glory. Sometimes it is about carrying the weight of what victory costs and choosing to walk away in silence. If you know another story like this, a forgotten innovator whose crazy idea changed history, share it in the comments. The archives of World War II contain hundreds of similar tales. Men and women who saw solutions others missed, who fought their own institutions as hard as they fought the enemy, who succeeded against impossible odds and then vanished into ordinary lives. Subscribe to discover more of these hidden histories, because the past is full of people who deserve to be remembered, and sometimes remembering them is the only monument they will ever receive. Ed Larner never asked to be called a hero. He just did what needed doing when no one else would try. 80 years later, that is still the definition of courage that matters most.